So in this lesson, we're going to look at inflation measurement and adjustment. Our focus here is going to be to see how inflation is actually measured within the economy and the importance of using that measurement in looking at economic well-being and the cost of living. So we want to begin, let's just go over our definitions again. So inflation is defined as the increase in price levels. Deflation is a decrease in price levels. The primary source of inflation is an increase in the money supply, which devalues the dollar and causes prices to increase, while deflation shows that prices falling as a result of the supply of money decreasing, because then the dollar becomes more valuable. We can measure inflation as the difference between nominal and real GDP using the deflator, because it's just nominal divided by real, and that gives us a percentage. But really, we don't want to measure everyday inflation rates with the deflator, because really with the deflator, what we're looking at is how much productivity actually occurred, because the difference between nominal and real GDP is the amount of inflation in the economy, but that's based on productivity levels. But inflation rate is the percentage change in the price level from the previous period. So inflation rates directly are affecting the cost of living, and so we want to measure prices. And so inflation rates are measured using the Consumer Price Index. It's what we call the CPI, and it's a measure of the average prices paid by consumers for a fixed market basket of goods and services. And we're going to break that definition down some. But we measure inflation rates by measuring prices, not just simply productivity. It doesn't equal out the way we want to see it that way. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the CPI each month using data from 30 metropolitan areas, and it monitors the change in the cost of living over time. So really what CPI is doing and is looking at this idea here, when CPI is rising, the average family has to spend more dollars to maintain the same standard of living. And that's really what CPI is designed to tell us is, are we having to spend more to maintain our same standard of living, or are we able to basically spend the same amounts to maintain the same standard of living? The typical answer to that one, of course, is no. Inflation rate is naturally rising within the economy, so there's always going to be that gap between nominal and real GDP. There's always going to be some measurement of inflation. The question, of course, is going to be what level does it rise? So the Consumer Price Index, it's calculated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they use a 5-step process, the first of which is to fix the basket. And this just means they're determining which prices are most important to the typical consumer. When you look on the far right over here from May of 2013, you can see the breakdown here. So 15% of monthly income just goes towards foods and beverages, whereas 41% goes towards housing, 4% is spent on apparel, 17% is transportation. So you can see the three primary areas in which the average consumer income goes towards are food and beverage, housing, and then transportation. And then it breaks down into other categories for how we sit things out. And so what that ends up occurring is CPI is basically this weighted categories that are determined by surveying customers, and that determines the average basket of goods and services in which they are going to look at prices. Now, what we can do is break down the basket of goods and services by looking specifically at that 15%, because I find this interesting. So 8% of that is cereals and bakery products, but 13% is meats and poultry, fish and eggs. And then we start to get down into the different categories as we look at how we're spending that 15% on food and beverage. But the overwhelming majority of it goes towards food away from home, so eating out. So when you look at the average American consumer, 38% of that 15% just goes towards eating out. And so 6% of it goes towards alcohol. So that should tell you something about the average income of American consumers. So this is how that 15% breaks down. And so they start to really break this down into prices to establish this 5-step process. So once the basket is fixed, the next step is to find the prices for all of these goods and services that are established by this, the basket that we're looking at. And then the third step is to use the data to calculate the cost. The fourth step will determine the base year and then calculate the CPI off that base year. And that's just a current year basket cost divided by base year times 100. So it's percentage, as we've been doing in a lot of our things, looking at that current year divided by that base year. And then this gives you the CPI for each year you're calculating. So remember, of course, the CPI purpose here is to measure the overall cost of goods and services. Now, as a final step is to calculate inflation rates from one year to the next, and inflation rate looks like this. So it's CPI in current year minus previous year divided by the CPI in the previous year times 100. So it's the new price minus the old divided by the old. So that gives you that percentage change in inflation rates. And we're going to look and actually just do an example of how this breaks down. So just as an example, so if we just fix a basket of saying 8 t-shirts, 4 steaks, and 3 houses. And so we establish the price of those 3 goods here for 3 years. You'll see 2008, 2009, 2010. This is essentially what the government with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is what they're doing when they start looking at all of this stuff. So they just break this down. You can see these numbers here. Step 3 is, of course, to determine this. So just do the quantity times the price, and then that gives you the cost of the basket for each year. So you can see in 2008, 2009, 2010, we saw 330, 72, 339, 100, 348, 140 that's our cost of our basket. So our base year will be our 2008 year, which means the CPI for the first year is always going to be 100 when you look at the base year. And then you see 103, 105. So those are the price indexes for 2009 and 2010. Now, when we calculate out the inflation rate, you'll see that the first year, of course, was easy, 3%. So from 2008 to 2009, inflation rose 3%. Now, from 2009 to 2010, you notice we have to do 105 minus 103 divided by 103. That gives us 1.94%. So that's how much inflation rose within the economy within that given time period. So 2008 to 2009, inflation rose 3%. 2009 to 2010, inflation rose 1.94%. So inflation overall, inflation essentially between 2008 and 2010, inflation rose 5%. So that's using that formula that we established a second ago, which is current year minus previous year divided by previous year. And so in our example, we can see that in our base year, we have 100, then 103, then 105. So using those numbers, we can determine what the inflation rates rose and how that developed. And this is exactly what is occurring monthly and then annually within the CPI. So rather than make you calculate that out, here are the CPI tables. This is 1947 to 2015. You can see these numbers. So you can get an idea pretty quickly. When you look at like 2015, you see 237, and just working backwards down to 22.3 for the CPI for each year. So we can use these to establish a lot of different things. So of course, this is how it's calculated. So if we want to look at the inflation rate as an example, so in 2015, the inflation rate was 237. In 2000, it was 172.2. So we can kind of calculate this out to see how much inflation rose. So what we're doing is saying 64.8, so that's 237 minus 172.2, divided by 172. So that gives us 0.376. So inflation has risen 37.6%. So in other words, what we're saying is that prices have increased 37.6% since the year 2000. So that's the inflation rate. And that's how that's used when we calculate this out. So we can break this down in any given time period and look at 2 time periods to give us an example of inflation rates. We could also, of course, work backwards and look at how the economy, how prices have deflated. If we wanted to know, for example, let's say that 2016 showed 235, then what we were seeing is deflation. So then when we did that math, we would come up with a percentage that told us that prices have fallen by X amount. So here we can graph, we can look at this and pull a line graph up to look at how CPI has risen. So you can look at it here and see that since 1913 to 2012, how CPI has risen annually within the economy. Notice it was fairly steady up until the end of World War I, and then about 1945, 46, 47, it begins to gently rise. But it's here in 71 that we begin to see it rise significantly. The reason for that is because in 1971, this President Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard, which limited the amount of money that could be produced within the economy because it was related back to the amount of gold we held. And by doing so, basically, they could print an unlimited amount of money, and that would expand the economy. And so you can see how that's influenced our inflation rate since 71. And so when we look at a lot of our graphs in terms of this macroeconomics, we're going to see this 1971 point an awful lot of times because we see how these different measurements have increased since that specific time period in that event. So on this slide, we want to look just specifically at monthly CPI in 2008. This is an interesting one. So if you look at 2008, this was the last time the U.S. was in a pretty significant recession. So you can see what's happening here. As inflation is increasing within the economy. It's going to peak here in July. You'll see there at about 220 is where it peaks, and then it begins to taper off again, so prices are falling. And what this tells us, of course, is if we kind of back up here a little bit, we can look at this January, February through July. We see price levels increasing, and then we start to see them fall again. And we see when price levels are falling, of course, this is deflation. And so we can track the recession and look and see what's taking place. So we know the recession in July, that was when it hit its worst point. That was when prices were at their highest level, and then they began to fall again. Now, falling prices, one of the things we've learned with Phillips curves, isn't exactly a good thing, because when prices begin to fall, like with our price levels, one of the things we kind of attribute that to is there being less money in the economy, which means people were saving money. And if people are saving money, then that means, of course, they're not spending. And if people aren't spending money, one of the things we see, of course, is that unemployment begins to rise because companies are laying people off. So just because prices are falling doesn't mean that people are spending, because typically prices falling, remember now, prices fall because the economy, because what we're seeing, of course, is deflation within the economy, removal of money. Well, why were prices falling? It's because people weren't spending as much money. So when you interpret this, you have to kind of think through that process of why prices are falling and what deflation exactly means. So on this third one, we want to look at the annual percentage change. So when we start looking at that percentage, remember this is the year one minus the original year divided by the original. So when we start looking here at 1914 to 2012, you'll notice I had to go down in the negatives because you'll see what happens here. So notice how inflation rates fluctuate quite a bit. Particularly early on, 1914 to about into the 1950s, inflation rates were widely fluctuating all over the place. In other words, prices were rising and prices were falling in huge amounts at the beginning of the 20th century through there. And then again in the 1930s, of course, prices fell massively because of the Great Depression. You know, you look at that negative 10% there in 1932 at the beginning of the Depression. So why did deflation, why were prices falling? Because people weren't spending. Now, whenever you see increases in the inflation rates, those prices rising, that should tell you something. Then that's when we see that spending take place. We see unemployment falling. And then, of course, we look and we see these negatives and we see, okay, this is where spending has kind of tapered off and prices are falling because people aren't spending money. So you can look at these different areas here and see what's taking place. You know, so if we look here in 1922 and then again here, so we look at these different time periods in which we've seen prices, we see this negative decline in prices in 2008 there into 2010. We see these declines here, and this is deflation within the economy. So we don't always see on a month to month, when we start to really break it down, we see this fluctuation. And of course, this mirrors that business model that we look at when we start talking about the rise and fall of the economy against that trend line in the business model. This is a good idea of what's taking place. So CPI is a highly accurate measure of the cost of living, but like any of our measurements, it's not perfect. GDP, which is the most used measurement, isn't perfect either because it's still somewhat of an educated estimate as to how much productivity is actually taking place. So none of our measurements are 100% accurate. Now it's referred to as a cost of living index. So it measures changes in the amount of money that people would need to spend to achieve a given standard of living. But there's two primary reasons as to why it's not perfect. Number one, it doesn't measure all the components of the cost of living. And second, the components that are measured aren't always measured accurately. We have three possible biases that comes into CPI measurements, which creates these problems that we see. One is unmeasured quality change, two is a substitution bias, and three is the introduction of new goods. So let's look at the first of these biases, this unmeasured quality change. So if the quality of a good in the basket deteriorates from one year to the next, then the value of the dollar declines, even though the price of the good stayed the same. At the same time, if the quality of a good improves, the dollar rises. iPads and iPhones are perfect examples of this concept. Every year, Apple is releasing new iPhones and they're releasing new iPads, but you'll notice the price of these never changes. The regular iPad has been $4.99 since the first was introduced, but if you look at the first iPad version compared to the latest, it's a significant difference in the quality of the product, yet the price of it has never changed. So there's right there is a perfect example of unmeasured quality changes as a bias. So Apple introduces these new models with improvements, yet prices are never changing. And so the Bureau adjusts the price of goods in the basket to account for quality improvements. And in its attempt, they try to measure goods that have a constant quality, for example, like a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk. But you can imagine quality change is very, very difficult to try to measure on an annual basis. And so estimates on price may be too high or too low, and thus inflation rates are affected. So if you think about it like this, if the Bureau, in an attempt to adjust inflation rates, overestimates on iPads, for example, then the inflation rate is affected. If they underestimate, then inflation rates are affected. And because they're estimating, it's not going to be 100% accurate. So our second issue here is the substitution bias. So when the price of goods change, consumers adjust their spending habits. This is the basic law of demand. So CPI measures a fixed basket that does not account for substitution by consumers. And that's an issue right away because we know, of course, if prices are increasing on some goods, then we'll stop and we'll substitute. Yet CPI measures a fixed basket that doesn't account for this basic substitution. So consumers don't just substitute products, but also where they shop. If prices are rising at Publix, then you won't shop at Publix, you'll go to Kroger or Walmart. And so there's right away we see these biases within substitution that creates a problem in measuring the accuracy of CPI. And what we call this, of course, is outlet substitution, because that right there is a substitution of where we're buying our goods based on the prices of goods at particular locations. Remember that all markets are these the places where the producers and consumers are interacting. And so if the price of goods in the markets goes up, then we'll find new markets. So our third issue here is the introduction of new goods. So when new goods are introduced into the market, the variety of goods and services to choose from increases. I mean, you just think about over time since the beginning of the 20th century into the 21st century, how many new products have been introduced into the market. And so what happens, of course, is each dollar becomes more valuable. And thus consumers need fewer dollars to maintain their current standard of living. But you got to remember CPI is based on a fixed basket. So here we have an issue in which the variety of goods for which we can choose is increasing on an annual basis, yet CPI measures a fixed basket which needs to remain constant across the number of years. So the resulting here is we see that estimates in the 1990s by several economists suggest the CPI could be inflated by as much as 1%. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about inflation rates and the value of the dollar, 1% becomes a fairly large amount. So the possibility of CPI being an inflated measure of inflation rates can create serious problems in society. For example, union contracts with firms often establish wage increases to be comparable to increase in cost of living. So if a contract is entirely based on how much inflation is occurring and that measurement is wrong, well then we've got issues within how employees are being paid. Now, this idea is based on the concept of a real wage, which is adjusted to current inflation rates. And so if inflation rates based on CPI are inflated, then the firm would be paying higher wages than the actual cost of living they intended. And this cost the company millions of dollars over the life of the contract and ultimately could make the firm actually less valuable. So while that would, of course, benefit the union employees, it doesn't benefit the company from the standpoint that over time that company actually becomes less and less valuable, which affects stockholders and investing. And CPI is also used in determining adjustments made to government expenditures in areas such as Social Security and food stamps. So if CPI is inflated here, the government is suspending above the perceived cost of living outlay. Now, while it would benefit those who receive the benefits, you can imagine the added spending would accumulate, increase the national debt. So it's very much this, if inflation rates are inflated, it is benefiting those individuals who are receiving the payments. But in actuality, over time, it's creating it's an accumulation of debt, and it's an accumulation of spending that doesn't necessarily need to take place. So how does CPI measure up to the GDP deflator in terms of measuring inflation, which is of course what both are doing? So both designed to measure changes in inflation, both doing it differently. The deflator, it deflates the nominal measurement of GDP to a real measurement to show us just the increase in productivity. So it doesn't measure household inflation. CPI, on the other hand, uses a fixed basket of goods to measure price increase, and it measures how the prices of a typical market basket of goods change over time. The deflator takes into account quality change and the introduction of new goods, and it eliminates that substitution bias we see. So it eliminates the biases that are problematic with CPI, and it reflects the price of all goods and services produced domestically. There's a major issue here though. CPI reflecting the price of all goods and services bought by consumers. So if you look at those two terms, so CPI reflects the prices of all goods and services bought by consumers. GDP deflator reflects the price of goods and services produced domestically. The problem here, of course, is the majority of what we purchase nowadays doesn't come domestically. It's coming from overseas. So even though they both measure inflation, you cannot trade one for another. So they're different measurements. When you put them side by side and look at the percentage change, you'll notice that for the most part, now I say for the most part, they move in the same direction and they're fairly consistent. But you'll also notice at the same time, sometimes they're not always, you'll notice there's differences between the two. So when we look at it, what we can say is that GDP and CPI for the most part will be consistent in terms of increasing and decreasing. But in terms of how they measure inflation, a good example of this is 1978 to 1984. The GDP price deflator is much, much lower than CPI is. So we're talking about a significant difference in terms of what the numbers actually come out to, even though they do tend to trend in the same direction. Let's look at the historical trend here. So when we look at this and break it down, so here's how GDP deflator has risen since 1995 to 2012, whereas here's CPI and how it's risen. So you'll notice how CPI has risen more quickly than the GDP deflator. So here's one of the things. So why are these two different measurements? The single biggest reason why these two are different measurements is shown on this graph. And what it tells us is when we're talking about CPI, we're talking about what we are buying. Well, what we are buying is being produced in different countries. The deflator, remember, is designed to develop what's produced domestically. It's our productivity. We're a service-based economy. The majority of people working in the United States work in a service-based industry. Whereas when we talk about CPI and what we're consuming and the goods we're purchasing, just take a look at the things you buy and where they come from. Most of them are coming from overseas. So what we're buying is not the same as what we're producing, and thus we see the difference between CPI and the GDP deflator. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to use CPI for correcting for the cost of living so you understand how this works. So one of the primary reasons in developing a price index is to compare dollar amounts at different times. And you can use the numbers from the index to compare dollar amounts from different time periods. So here we have our table for CPI. This is current up to 2015 dollars. And so we're going to use McDonald's, for example. So let's start about in 1956 is when McDonald's opened. So we want to know what the price of a 1956 McDonald's hamburger is in the 2015 dollar amount. So this gives us an idea of adjusting for inflation based on a product that hasn't changed much over time. So in 1956, a McDonald's hamburger was 15 cents. We're going to multiply that times, and what we'll do is we'll take 237, which is our current year that we're using, so that's 2015's price index, divided by 27.2, which is the 1956 price index. And so what's going to happen is that's going to equal out to $1.30. So when we take 237 divided by 27.2, and then we multiply that by 0.15, so that's 15 cents, what we get is it equals $1.30. Now we can go the other direction as well. So the price of a McDonald's hamburger in 1956 dollars. Well, the hamburger today costs $1.29. So you see that $1.30, you see how the price here has been adjusted, it's corrected for inflation. So the price of McDonald's hamburger today is $1.29. So if we take 27.2 divided by 237, we end up with 15 cents. So This gives you a very good idea of how McDonald's has adjusted the price of their products for inflation. Because in 1956, the hamburger was 15 cents. Today it's $1.29, and you can see how those average out here when you look at correcting for inflation. Now, what's interesting about this, of course, is the hamburger hasn't changed much over time. It's pretty much the exact same burger you're getting, except for the price of it has increased by $1.15. So that's the cost of inflation. And so you can see the difference. Now, I will tell you this, in 2012, that same hamburger was only 89 cents. So it gives you a really good idea of what's taking place. If in 2012 the hamburger was 89 cents, in 2015 it's $1.29, you can see how much inflation has risen basically in the 21st century as compared to, say, the 20th century. Okay, so let's look at nominal versus real prices. So what economists are really doing when they run these calculations is converting a nominal value into a real value. So the nominal value is expressed in current dollars, such as 15 cents and $1.29, whereas the real value is one that is adjusted for inflation based on the given year, like $1.30 and 15 cents. So really what we're saying is that if we adjust these into real values, the worth of a McDonald's hamburger is 15 cents, which essentially would equate to having $1.30 in 1956. I mean, so in other words, what you had in 1956, that 15 cents would buy you $1.30 worth of goods, when you start to adjust those time periods. So real values represent purchasing power of nominal values in given years. And so that's really what we're trying to say is how much value does that amount hold? What will 15 cents get you? What will $1.30 get you at a given time? Well, 15 cents in 2015 dollars won't get you anything, more or less. Whereas that same amount in 1956 gets you a hamburger, and actually that 15 cents in a real value is worth $1.30. That's more or less what this is trying to tell you. So the nominal value of a hamburger from McDonald's in 1956 was 15 cents, but the real value using like 2012 dollars or 2015 dollars was $1.30. So you can see the difference in prices. And so when we look at it here, this is the U.S. historical trend. So this is nominal versus real oil prices. So this gives us a good example of looking at it. So you'll notice the nominal prices here are these are the dashed, and they are below the real because it's based on 2010 prices. So when we look at 2010 and we work backwards, we notice the gap develops, and that's because of the constant price range we're using. So prices remained relatively stable until the OPEC oil embargo drove prices up in 1973, and you can see that when you start looking here in the shaded area. So that's the OPEC oil embargo, and you can see what happened from a pricing perspective as prices rose significantly. And what this knows is we look at that nominal value and how low it is, but that's because of the 2010 dollars. When we look at that real, we see just how much that actually was costing. So prices, when we look at it, we say, okay, well, prices never got above 40. Well, and the reality is if we look at real inflation adjusted prices, it went up almost to around 100. So this allows us to kind of get a better idea of what's happening. So since then, prices have fluctuated, but real prices have remained higher than nominal. And that's one of the things as we start to see is that when you look at this, when we hit 2010, what we'll start to see, of course, is that nominal prices will go above real prices. And you can see the gap getting smaller and smaller, of course, as we get to that constant year. Okay, so we just looked at the difference between nominal and real prices. Noticing, of course, that real prices that's the actual value of the product versus the nominal, which is what you're really paying. And we can do the same thing with wages. We use a term called indexation. It's a technique to adjust income payments or wages by means of a price index, which is a CPI. And it's used to maintain consumer purchasing power in the face of inflation. So if we want people to be able to maintain their current standard of living, then wages have to increase basically relative to inflation rates increasing. And so the result, when wages are indexed to inflation, we see there's a nominal wage rate, which is what you're getting paid, and that's the average hourly wage rate measured in the current dollar amount. And so nominal wage rates measure a combination of two things. One is a change in the quality of goods and services as they increase that you can buy, plus a change in the price level. So nominal wages basically are designed, like I said, to keep you being able to purchase on that current standard of income that you're already at. The real wage rate, on the other hand, this is the average hourly rate measured in a given reference year. So this is that constant dollar amount. And the real wage rate represents the quantity of goods and services that an hour's work can buy. Real wages provide a clear representation of a worker's actual wages, because then that tells you and we're always with the real, it's inflation adjusted. So this gives us an idea of what we can really actually purchase, as opposed to, say, what we can purchase based on price levels. Okay, this will help you understand nominal wages and real wages very simply. So what we're looking at is 2005. So here's the thing, we're going to use a GDP deflator, and this is what you should expect to see. You would expect that everything to 2005, real wage above nominal, because of when we're measuring, but everything after 2005, nominal will be above real. That's what you're going to see. So when we look at the minimum wage rate, in 1978 it was $2.65. So you'll notice minimum wages are increasing, but see what happens to real wages after 2005? So here's what we see. Since 1978, minimum wage has increased from $2.65 to $7.25, but the actual purchasing power has fallen. And that's the part you really want to focus on, is that what you can buy with a minimum wage has actually gone down. So whereas in 1978, $2.65 would buy you $6.56 worth of goods. In 2012, $7.25 would only buy you $6.28 worth of goods. So that's really, when we look at real wages, that's what we're talking about, is exactly how much can you buy. And what we notice, of course, is that even though nominal wages have increased, real wages have gone down. There's a gap developing between the two because of inflation rate. So you can't purchase as much in 2012 at $7.25 an hour as you could in 1978 at $2.65 an hour. That's what this minimum versus this real versus nominal wage rates is really telling us. So as we can see, purchasing power of minimum wage is decreasing while prices are increasing. In other words, what's happening to us is we can't buy as much because prices are increasing, whereas the purchasing power is in decline. So therefore, would an increase in minimum wage actually allow families to purchase more? And that's one of these constant questions that we seem to see within government all the time. And our next one, or does the minimum wage need to be indexed for inflation and look more like a living wage? And the answer to that one is absolutely. If you were to index a minimum wage to look more like a living wage, minimum wage would increase significantly, because right now minimum wages, of course, as we see, do not have an equal purchasing power. Whereas if you were to increase the minimum wage and index it, it would increase quite significantly, and it would look more like what it's actually being purchased, because it would use that real wage rate as opposed to looking at the nominal.